Today, our high streets are literally littered with cafes. There's one practically on every street corner, ranging from the independent to the gigantic chain. Though this seems to be a characteristic of our modern trend-driven lifestyle, the coffee house actually has been a characteristic of British culture since the 17th century, frequented by the likes of Samuel Pepys and Isaac Newton. Though each cafe today has its own contemporary vibe, you could call coffee houses and coffee culture traditional. But what exactly was the foundation of this tradition? When and how did our relationship with coffee begin? And what exactly is that relationship? In its infancy, coffee culture in England was seen as almost alternative. The coffee house a revolutionary space. Maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic here, but that's up for you to decide by the end of this video. Charles II did attempt to ban coffee houses though, so if the party-loving king thought there was a threat, there had to be something going on. We will predominantly be looking at 17th century England, with some brief references to earlier and later periods. Without further ado, let's jump straight into a more in-depth look at England's history with the coffee house. As with many English traditions and delicacies, coffee is not English. It did not grow here, and the culture surrounding it is not entirely individual either. Of course, when it came over to England, it was squeezed through our own cultural frameworks and reshaped as it was translated. So where did coffee and coffee house traditions begin? Coffee in the 17th century was grown in North Africa, and coffee house culture was said to have begun in the Ottoman Empire and the Islamic world, starting first in 15th century Damascus, then spreading to the Ottoman Empire capital of Istanbul by the 16th century. As Islam is a sober religion, coffee houses acted as a sober mirror for the public house by way of comparison. They were a key hub for community. People would gather to chat, play games, tell stories, and discuss news and current goings-on. However, imams in Mecca became concerned by the coffee house culture in the early 16th century, leading to attempts to ban them. They were worried they were becoming hotspots for political unrest and secret drinking. The bans collapsed though, due to their unpopularity. The coffee house was just too ingrained in the community. As trade brings coffee to Europe later in the century, you will see a strangely similar story. So how did coffee get to England? Coffee first reached Europe through Italy. Italy had trade links with Northern Africa, also known as wars and occupations. They saw a market for this new drink and began spreading their new discovery, café. It was under this name that it first reached England in the late 16th century. Let's first understand what coffee was like in the 17th century. Today we have a seemingly endless variety of choices in cafes to suit everyone's taste, but that was not a thing. Quick big shout out to our friends from Casperton's Emporium, whose set up from an event with us you will be seeing for this portion of the video. Coffee arrived in the UK looking like this. These are uncooked green coffee beans. These are then roasted up in a skillet over a fire. Once they are completely roasted, they would be crushed up in a pestle and mortar into a consistency more like coffee grounds. A muslin bag would then be used like a filter paper today, or a strange kind of coffee tea bag creation. The full bag would then be placed in a pot of boiling water and allowed to steep. The result would be drinking coffee. This was served simply as was, or sometimes with sugar if you could afford it, but never milk. The initial reaction of the English palate to coffee was not good. In 1610, one George Sandys wrote that coffee was black as soot and tasted not much unlike it. General reaction named coffee gritty and bitter. Even the smell was raged against at times, with later coffee house proprietor James Farr being prosecuted for producing so-called evil smells. So how on earth did it take off and enter the public consciousness? The 16th and 17th century for England were times of global exploration, often at the advancement for England and not so much everyone else. As such, there was a fashion and fascination with items and delicacies from around the world. Virtuosi culture was sweeping through the UK's middle classes and upper classes. This was a kind of subculture with a deep fascination, not necessarily always an appreciation, of foreign cultures and the exotic. These were mostly men, typically amateurs, hence why they had to be wealthy, who took an interest in science, arts, and antiquity, which extended to the new discoveries coming from abroad. They often owned a cabinet of curiosities. Sometimes it was a literal cabinet, sometimes it was just a name for a much larger collection. Take this image, the frontispiece to Museum Wormianum, a catalogue of Ole Wurm's collection. What this image depicts was considered a cabinet of curiosities, but it is, as you can see, a whole museum. Coffee appealed to those who were interested in or collectors of, so-called at the time, curiosities. It was through them that it ultimately started to get popularized, as they provided an accessible window for the wider population. If these wealthy and learned lads were drinking this newfangled drink, then surely it's not so scary. It's actually kinda cool. However, coffee was not initially advertised as a drink purely for pleasure. In fact, it was initially brought over as medicine, more specifically as a purgative. I trust I don't need to go into detail there. As such, it had a little bit of a PR problem. It was seen as a drug of sorts alongside other imports like marijuana and opium, which had also been brought over as medicine, then discovered to have much more fun uses, not to mention the fun new buzz that coffee created. Remember, of course, that people in 17th century England had never experienced caffeine to this extent. Imagine being your average 17th century guy, drinking this new curious medicine a doctor gave you, and suddenly feeling much more awake and alert. Even if it was considered a new drug by some, that ultimately didn't hinder coffee's spread and reception too far. Escapism through various substances is not a modern phenomenon. I've already mentioned marijuana and opium, but there's a much more obvious substance that ultimately led to coffee culture taking off: alcohol. In the mid-17th century, the majority of people living in England lived by Puritan values. Puritan values and excessive alcohol use did not agree with one another, but the public house, the pub, was an important, if not central, part of the community. Pubs were an affordable social space that allowed you to leave your worries at the door and just enjoy. A place to talk to your neighbours, sing the latest ballad, and read together. Yep, that's right. Read. Many people were illiterate in the 17th century, it's true, but print culture had really taken off with the brief window of censorship collapse during the British Civil Wars. Every community had at least someone who could read, and reading was social. Those who could read would read aloud. Newsbooks, ballads, satirical sheets, Bible verses, the list goes on. The public house was where your lower class worker could get access to the recent goings-on and changing trends and tastes of their contemporary culture. But this was the era of Puritanism. The public house was also the venue for drunken scandal and sinful excess. But to give up the public house was not just giving up alcohol, it was giving up community. There had to be an alternative. The first coffee house in England was the Angel in Oxford. This was opened by a Turkish Jewish man named Jacob in 1650. It was not the only coffee house for long, with a man named Pasqua Rose, a Dalmatian servant of Daniel Edwards, a trader, opening in London in 1652. Edwards had picked up the coffee drinking habit while working and trading in the Levant and Ottoman Empire. Rose was responsible for making said coffee, even when Edwards returned to the UK. It's said that Edwards asked Rose to open the house because so many people were coming to his house to try the coffee he was bringing back that it was disrupting his family life. By 1663, there were 80 in London, and by 1675, there were 3,000 in England. So even though no one was really raving about the drink itself, it had started to take off. Why then? The Puritan temperance movement was taking off, but people missed the enjoyment they'd get from alcohol. Coffee, though used as medicine, was not quite being considered a drug by most people. Therefore, the caffeine buzz was socially acceptable and even, at some times, respectable. Even drinking coffee to excess doesn't exactly cause intoxication, and coffee isn't mentioned in the Bible, so we mentioned the pub at this time was becoming a less and less acceptable place to go, but it was a key social centre for your community. The coffee house was able to fill this hole. Coffee houses came to be known as penny universities for two reasons. Firstly, a cup of coffee was cheap. Only a penny most of the time. This meant it was very accessible to the lower classes. Privately buying your own coffee beans to enjoy at home was a little pricier, but the coffee house brew was accessible. The new and exciting drink brought all kinds of clientele from all kinds of economic backgrounds, including those virtuosi groups we mentioned before. Within the walls of the coffee house, the layout was open and designed for socializing, so it was not a segregated space. The upper and lower class customers would be sat close by, if not next to each other. Naturally, they would begin to mingle. Each was being exposed to new education and ideas they wouldn't have been able to access before, hence the university part. Pay for a penny cup, get an education. Remember, a key draw of the pub was the communal share of information and ideas. Well, in the coffee house, this was not just through news books and ballads, with the elite, if they were to be found, in private rooms or tucked away at nicer tables, but coming directly from the learned gentry themselves over a fashionable cup of coffee. In fact, the very idea that the lower, possibly illiterate classes could partake in something so fashionable and imported was a novelty, or in some people's point of view, a scandal. The coffee house completely challenged the hierarchies and societal structures of the mid-17th century. It had become such a focal point for community that after the Great Fire of 1666 that destroyed London, coffee houses were some of the first places to be rebuilt. As we reached the era of monarchy restoration and the end of Puritan rule, as we were in the 1660s now, the pub was a lot more socially acceptable again, but the coffee house had become ingrained in popular culture. It's important to note, though, that the coffee house was not some completely classless utopia. Though the space was not segregated and coffee was an accessible price, there was some distinction between the wealthy and the less so. Remember how coffee was made? The muslin bag of coffee being left in the boiling water and ladling out cups? Well, they wouldn't be making fresh coffee all day. The water was being replaced once empty, but the bag was left until too weak to continue using it. So the quality of the coffee would slowly decline throughout the day, and when it declined, so did the price. The less wealthy would have to go to work during the day. The learned, chattering elite would not so much. The elite would therefore have better access to the fresher, slightly pricier pot, and the working class would have access later in the day to the diluted, old, been steeping for ages, fourth time being boiled pot. So there was still some sense of hierarchy. Not much. The elite would still go whilst the poorer were there, and the poorer were not cut off from the nicer brew. However, obviously, the mixing of social classes in such an open and uncontrolled way was a little scary for some, especially whilst the British Civil Wars, where social structure was turned upside down, was still in living memory for many. It was particularly scary to Charles II. The elitist of the elite, the court and its courtiers, were unlikely to be found in the coffee house. If they wanted coffee, they'd simply buy the beans and have the kitchens brewed up for them. Some more middling classes would also buy their coffee in this way, but as we said, the general want for alternative social spaces led people out to the coffee house. The court understood the pub, they had yet to understand the coffee house. It's important to remember that Charles II lost his father due to civil war, not just a king. Anywhere with large gatherings of mixed classes stank of rebellion to Charles II, and were therefore terrifying. To him and his fellow ex-exiled cavaliers, it possibly seemed literally like life or death. In 1674, Charles's chief minister, Lord Danby, was saying coffee houses were dangerous breeding grounds for political unrest, and paranoia was growing that they were fronts for the distribution of revolutionary pamphlets. He was not entirely delusional to think so. As we said, social and communal spaces like pubs and coffee houses did involve the reading aloud of newsbooks and pamphlets. The breakdown of class order meant that exactly what writings were being read were changing, and possibly a lot more frequently the kind of things the elite didn't want the lower classes to read. The fear was also because print culture was such an important factor in the civil wars, enough to be considered by some a war in print, with battles occurring in ink, royalist against parliamentarian accounts of events, subtle propaganda, and satires. Anything that was a key spark or fuel during the civil wars to Charles II was something that killed his dad. As the guy who would be next should it happen again, the increased spread of print just screamed danger. So, in 1675, he agreed that Danby could issue a proclamation banning the coffee house. It didn't last long. The people resented it, not just that the king was trying to nose into their everyday lives, but that he was trying to weigh a key pillar of community, a sober one and a fashionable one at that. It kind of reminded them of the Puritan repression that Charles and his court were pushing. There was also backlash from the economic side. As the coffee house and coffee itself was in demand, naturally traders had brought a whole lot of it. If coffee culture was going to be banned, what on earth were they going to do with all of it? It literally put livelihoods at stake. Suddenly, taking away the coffee house was a lot scarier than letting them be. So by the late 17th century, coffee houses had become established throughout what is now called the United Kingdom and Ireland. We've been speaking fairly broadly about what the coffee house culture was like in the mid-17th century, but while we approached the turn of the century, a new kind of culture was taking hold. Much like today, coffee houses had regulars. For an example, poet John Dryden discovered that being so much of a regular could be dangerous. In 1679, he published a work called An Essay Upon Satire, which criticized the womanizing culture of the court, specifically the Earl of Rochester, who was furious. Dryden was known to frequent Will's coffee house, along with many other intellectuals and writers, so Rochester hired men to attack him on his walk home. Dryden was injured but survived. As with Will's coffee house, the majority of coffee houses turned from general places of community to hosting specific communities, often based on political belief or profession. If it were by profession, sometimes the space would start to become multi-use. For example, London's Stock Exchange began in Jonathan's coffee house in 1698. Politicians hung around White's coffee house at St James's. Button's coffee house at Bow Street was the haunt for writers, whilst clergymen preferred Child's at St Paul's Churchyard. People began to become particularly attached, even loyal, to their coffee house community. A famous example, though about a century later, was John Freeth's coffee house, the Leicester Arms, in 1768. He used his coffee house as the HQ of his Jacobin club. Though he was not qualified or educated, he used this to style himself as a scientist, creating a clientele interested in self-improvement and the sciences, as well as those sharing his political affiliations. The Minerva Tavern down the road was frequented by Tories, and they hated this Jacobin club, so subsequently they hated Freeth's coffee house. So much so that they placed a sign above their fireplace saying, "No Jacobin admitted here." Pasqua Rosé's place, remember him? Was one of those houses that was rebuilt quickly after the Great Fire, but it was renamed the Jamaica Coffee House. Cromwell had conquered Jamaica in 1655, which had made sugar more accessible for England. The coffee house was renamed so, as it started to become a haunt for merchants and colonialists. In early modern England, people would place ads in the paper for their lost property. This included servants or enslaved people who had run away. In 1718, an ad was placed for a 15-year-old they called James, asking he be taken not directly to his so-called master, but to the Jamaica Coffee House. The coffee house loyalties were not always so innocent and simple as community building. The darker stains of colonialism are never too far from the surface. Why am I bringing this up? Because for so much of this video, we discovered how the coffee house was a space that blurred social lines for rich and poor alike, where ideas could be spread and community was built. But who exactly for? It was not a safe space for everyone. Quite often, histories of trade, new discoveries, and greater equality have a dark underbelly, consisting of who was cut off from such improvements, or who was crushed underneath these new foundations. Now, just a quick section to say here that we haven't mentioned women at all in this video, and that's because women were excluded from coffee house culture. Not coffee itself, necessarily. If you were wealthy and could afford to buy the beans yourself, but no women were allowed in the coffee house. There were a couple of times they were allowed on the premises, but not for the same purpose as the men. As we said, coffee houses became multi-purpose spaces. So if that house doubled as an auction house, for example, a woman acting as the rep for her household would be allowed to take part. But they were still, contrary to the pub, excluded from the culture. And this led to a pamphlet called the Women's Petition Against Coffee in 1674. The specific complaints in the pamphlets were a little odd though. Perhaps they were sticking to complaints they knew would get through and be taken seriously as women's complaints, rather than risking being seen as stepping on men's business. So they complained that coffee was making their husbands impotent and sterile, and away from home for too long. Indeed, the full title of the petition refers to coffee as that drying, enfeebling liquor. All this to say, though the coffee house was empowering for some, it left many behind. Let's try and pull all this together. In this video, we've discussed a complicated history that mixes global culture and trade, social revolution, or more accurately, evolution, conservative gender segregation, community building, and religion. Hanging over all of this is the dark shadow of colonialism and the trade of enslaved people. Whilst coffee and coffee houses represented progress for white working and middle-class men, it was quite a different story for everyone else. We can see the foundations of our coffee house tradition in the 17th century, with established regulars and clientele, each having a slight niche. It's a place we tend to associate with community to this day, catching up over a cup of coffee with your friends. A mostly sober place, where the only buzz is caffeinated. It's also kind of still an intellectually driven place, many people using it as a place to study and work. Yes, I'm aware that's a bit of a stretch. Ultimately though, the coffee house seems to have been popularized by a need for community, and it still provides that same space today.